Ancient Egypt loved its symbols, and one of the smallest stole a leading role: the honeybee. It touched politics, belief, and the way the state explained itself. You see, the Egyptian throne carried a paired emblem, the sedge and the bee, which read as, "He of the sedge and the bee." It meant one king ruling two regions, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, together. And you see it early. From the first dynasty, around 3000 BC, the formula appears with royal names. King Den is the earliest known user at accession, which is a very official way to say, day one on the job. After that, it runs for centuries, right up to the last native rulers in the 4th century BC. On monuments, the bee shows up near cartouches, like at Karnak, where carved bees sit by king names as if stamping the paperwork. Now, why the creature mattered is also practical. As touched upon earlier, a hive's order under a single queen looked a lot like the political ideal: one land under one ruler. Then you get the sacred layer. Later tradition said bees sprang from the tears of Ra, giving honeymakers a divine origin story. So, when a pharaoh bore the bee, he was talking provinces, while hinting at renewal and rightful lineage under the gods. At the same time, beekeepers were building the king's sweetness, one hive at a time. So let's step into the apiary. Beekeeping in ancient Egypt. By around 650 BC, the tomb of Pabasa shows organized beekeeping with workers sliding combs from horizontal mud hives and jarring the honey. It is familiar work because Egypt had practiced apiculture since the Old Kingdom. Hives were clay tubes about a meter long and 30 to 40 centimeters wide, stacked in rows with small entrances and lids you could remove for harvest. Archaeology backs this up with waxy clay cylinders and bee remains at Nuser's Sun Temple at Abu Ghurab from around 2400 BC and at Kahun in the Fayum. Yes, archaeology can be sticky. Tomb reliefs read like manuals. On Unis's Causeway, from around 2350 BC, keepers smoke bees with smouldering dung or wood, then collect the comb. And in Reckmeyer's tomb from around 1450 BC, one man swings a censer while another removes combs, and the scenes show straining and sealing jars to keep out spoilage and ants. Practical, if not glamorous. And the bureaucracy noticed. Titles include Overseer of Beekeepers, and Nekara held Overseer of all Beekeepers, which sounds grand until you picture the meetings. Temples and estates ran the big apiaries. So, most honey came from those institutions, not small farmers. New Kingdom lists count hundreds of jars, so the output was large. Keepers even moved hives by barge to chase blooms, upstream to Upper Egypt's clover, then down to the delta. Follow the floral calendar tied to flood and recession, and you can harvest several times a year. The toolkit barely changed for millennia. Pabasa's scenes repeat the same horizontal hives, the same smoke, and the same careful extraction. Demand stayed high, and some honey was imported, with jars labeled by origin so buyers knew the source. Egypt's native bee, Apis mellifera lamarcki, fit the climate and the Nile's atmosphere. Reliefs even show keepers without veils, sometimes covering their mouths, managing swarms and stings with steady hands. The industry produced honey, beeswax, and propolis for medicine, ritual, and daily use, which was an efficient system, but a slightly painful job, on the other hand, The real story starts after the squeeze. Honey as a strategic resource. At Amenhotep III's palace in the 14th century BC, a jar shard carries a tiny bee and the word for honey. That little drawing says a lot about Egyptian logistics, which were frankly on point. Honey, after all, was strategy. Medical papyri leaned on it. The Ebers Papyrus lists honey across many remedies, and Egyptian surgeons favored a classic salve of honey, grease, and lint for cuts and burns. The Edwin Smith text goes the same direction, using honey to keep wounds from getting infected. Doctors also used honey to soothe coughs and carry bitter drugs, which we'll talk about more later. It even shows up in gynecological recipes, because of course it does. One contraceptive mixed honey with acacia and dates. Ferment that acacia and you get lactic acids with real spermicidal bite. As food, honey sat at the luxury end of the shelf. It sweetened cakes and bread and even touched beer and wine when budgets allowed. And temples loved that stuff. Jars went out as offerings, and priests set small dishes with bread and beer, since honey signaled purity and favor. Under Rameses III, around 1180 BC, the state sent large honey donations to Hapi, the Nile deity. Tons of it. Those flows ran through royal and temple estates, which tracked supplies with almost obsessive care. Storage tells the story. From Amarna and Thebes to Malkata, rooms held labeled jars, some noting grade like clear or even red honey, and imports arrived in Canaanite transport jars that sometimes carried honey among other goods. You can almost hear the quartermaster sighing over inventory, and about the sticky myth that Egyptians preserved whole bodies in vats of honey. Great image, but it wasn't their method. What we actually see is beeswax used in mummification to seal the skull, close incisions and coat wrappings, with some analyses pointing to propolis in embalming mixes as well. Analyses of 18th dynasty mummies show embalming balms built on beeswax with resins and oils. Propolis was likely added for antimicrobial action, though evidence is limited. The role of honey, specifically, is uncertain and minor, as it never replaced natron for drying. Confidence levels land at high for beeswax, which was moderate for propolis, but low for honey. Honey likely worked symbolically in rites like anointing and the opening of the mouth. Egyptians, after all, knew that honey preserves food. Sealed New Kingdom jars kept crystallized honey for millennia, so it suited offerings and ideas of purity. Beeswax, on the other hand, was even more strategic. It fed candles and some lamps, especially in temples and later periods. It enabled lost wax casting for fine metalwork. It sealed and waterproofed jars and documents. Seal impressions with bees hint at royal links. Wax even served classrooms and shrines. Student scribes wrote on waxed wooden boards with a stylus, then smoothed them clean. A few tablets still show faint hieratic. Greece and Rome later adopted the practice. Grooming also leaned on beeswax. Mixed with oil or fat and resins, it formed ointments and perfume cones that melted on hair and wigs. Wax even stiffened wigs and shaped mustaches, which was an early form of hair wax. Heck, even ritual and magic used wax figures. Some cursed enemies by burning or piercing. Others protected homes as images of gods. Texts also mention a wax abaton ball for warding off harm. And overall, the economy ties it together. Temples collected honey as offerings and tax. Officials received jars, artisans relied on wax, households prized sweetness. Honey often traded at high value, sometimes by weight against metals. Similarly, what healed bodies also fed belief. Bees in religion and myth. As you already know by now, Egyptians tied bees to the divine. One origin tale says bees sprang from Ra's tears, then got busy in flowers, making honey and wax. So that gives bees a cosmic origin. It makes honey sacred, and it casts them as messengers between worlds. A Dendera hymn invokes the tears of Ra. So offering honey returned part of his gift. Honey read as pure and powerful, even the nectar of the gods. It fed bodies and spirits, the sweetness of life that hinted at immortality in tomb scenes where honey and beer nourish the blessed dead. Deity links pile up, too. Prescriptions soothe Sekhmet with honey. The pyramid texts liken Nut to a bee. And Neith holds the title, Mistress of the House of the Bee at Sais. Fertility cults took honey, too. At Edfu's beautiful reunion, priests present jars of honey. In Hathor's rites, it is said to make the heart glad. At Dendera, one festival barred priests from eating honey, likely for purity tied to Ra. Honey even marks death and return with Osiris and Anubis, and some traditions give Osiris honey cakes for mummification. There's also evidence of priests washing their hands with honey and natron. A new kingdom spell calls honey sweet to the living, but bitter to the dead. So, it guards thresholds and keeps spirits out. There are some texts that summon the bee to sting the enemy. There's even one spell that warns tomb robbers with swarms. Later writers even let souls appear as bees, though, that never became mainstream. In the opening of the mouth, priests anoint the lips with honey and wine. In other words, the milk of Isis and honey of Ra. This is to wake the senses. Meanwhile, outside the temple, swarms had another reputation. Economy, state, and daily life. Since bees were part of the ancient Egyptian economy, the state managed redistribution, so villages paid in goods and temples, and palaces handed out rations. Honey moved through that system like any other staple, only stickier. As we touched upon earlier, Old Kingdom lists record jars of honey as tax, and by the New Kingdom, palace and temple accounts shelved honey beside oils and metals, which tells you how valuable it was. Amun's estates produced honey for offerings and for staff, because even priests need paydays. Ramesside papyri show rations of honey for specialists, including doctors and officials. At Deir el-Medina, workers received grain, beer, and vegetables, with extra honey for illness or festivals. One text notes honey and figs at a feast of Maat, which sounds like a pretty good day. Prices put honey near the top tier. A deben of honey could match a deben of copper, and a small jar might cost you a goat, which feels dramatic, but then you remember it is honey. Most households used date or grape syrup instead. A New Kingdom ostrakon even lists a sweet beer made by fermenting honey with dates. At home, honey doubled as medicine. It went into herb infusions for coughs, onto scrapes, or into warm water to calm a sore throat. One spell for a crying infant told parents to write protective words on a leaf, dissolve it in honey, and then feed it to the child, which is very on brand for the period. Beeswax powered the workshop too. Carpenters waxed drill bits and saws. Tomb models show neat little wax balls. Musicians and archers treated strings. Sewers drew linen through wax. Basket makers waterproofed with wax linings. Wax tablets let teachers and merchants write and erase, and a few still carry hieratic. Artists used lost wax casting and later encaustic painting, as in the Fayum portraits. Pharaohs sent expeditions to find wild nests and myrrh, while Delta governors forwarded choice honey to the palace. Most people rarely got honey straight from the jar. They tasted it in festival beer or received it from state doctors. A Deir el-Medina note shows the government supplying honey and oil to the village physician and treating honey like a core drug. New Kingdom love poems call kisses honey sweet, which tells you the flavor of luxury. Bee products also kept work moving. Beekeepers and overseers ran the hives. Later, candle makers joined perfumers and unguent makers, and Amana workshops still show beeswax traces. Also, nothing went to waste. Larvae and dead bees went into ointments or feed, and leftover wax was melted down again. You can picture it. A priest lighting a beeswax lamp. A mother spreading a thin layer of honey on bread. A scribe polishing a wax board. Villagers lifting cups of honeyed beer and calling it a good day. In the end, ancient Egypt's quiet power wasn't bronze or granite. It was the bee. It helped bind a crown. It fought infection. It fed gods. It armed artisans. And when cornered, it may have even scattered enemies, imaginatively speaking. And from flowers it spun tribute, medicine, and luxury. The tears of a god made everything sweet. The Egyptians trusted bees. It reminds us that small, steady work can hold a whole society together.